In this video, I'm going to be answering the question, how do I begin my research? And to do so, I'm going to be talking to you about a research strategy that seems to help students ensure that they break down large research questions into bite-sized chunks. Broadly speaking, the three questions on which you are ruminating with any research project are, what do I already know? What do I want to know, or what are the gaps in my knowledge, and how can I answer those questions, or how can I fill those gaps in my knowledge? Conducting research, in truth, is a never-ending cycle, so you could always come up with more questions to answer, and that's why research is a progressive thing. You always have other people building upon the research of previous researchers. So you need to decide when to stop spinning around on that research cycle once you've accumulated enough evidence and knowledge in order to produce an assignment of the quality or standard that you want to do for what you're aiming to accomplish. For more tips about writing, please do see my video on the Peel method. The link for that will be at the end of this video. So in order to start on your research strategy, I like to follow the research strategy pictured here. So a sort of cycle where you're constantly answering and coming up with new questions, as I mentioned. And this cycle really helps you to break down your research into digestible fragments, because it can seem quite overwhelming when you begin a research project, but approaching it this way will help you to accomplish it in little bits at a time and produce a high caliber assignment. So let's go over to the handout that I've prepared on the research strategy and start breaking down an example question. So the first step on my research strategy is to make note of the larger question for my project or my assignment and think about what are the smaller questions I could break this into. And indeed, if I already know something about this subject, I might already know the answers to some of these questions, and that's okay. Try to approach this as though you're somebody who knows nothing about this topic. If they see this question, what are some of the natural questions that they might think of in order to answer that question? So first, I'm going to start with the larger research question that I have and add that to my worksheet. So for the purposes of this example, let's say that my larger question is, what was the relationship between Catholic emancipation and the repeal of the Test and Corporation Acts? So the first thing I want to do is break this up into smaller questions. Even if I already know the answer to some of these questions, that's okay. Pretend I'm explaining it to somebody who knows nothing about this topic and think about what are the obvious questions I would want to convey. So one question I can think of is, what was the Catholic Emancipation Act? And then I come up with some further questions, such as why was it issued and when? And of course, what was the repeal of the Test and Corporation Acts? When was this issued and why? Step 2, think about what you already know. So think about those questions that you came up with in step 1, where you broke down your larger research question into smaller ones, and make notes of those to which you already know the answer. You will need to find evidence to still back these up as references in your work, but nonetheless, it's still helpful to start categorizing what you do know and what you don't know. So now in step 2, I'm addressing the questions that I came up with in question 1 and putting down what I already know. So I know that the Catholic Emancipation Act had to do with removing restrictions on Catholics in the political sphere. And I know that it was issued in 1830. I know that the repeal of the Test and Corporation Acts also likewise had to do with removing restrictions on dissenters, which were those Christians who were Protestants, but not in the Church of England. And I know that this took place in 1828. Step number 3, what do I need to know? And I think this is where some of the proper research really begins. This is where you start identifying gaps in your knowledge that you're going to fill in the next step of the cycle. So in step 1, you identified the big question and broke that down into smaller questions. In step 2, you put what you already knew in answers to those questions that you developed. So now in step 3, you're breaking this down even further into what you don't know. So looking at the questions you came up with in step 1, what further questions could you ask that you don't quite know the answers to yet? So I start thinking about the gaps in my knowledge and what are some additional questions to which I'd like to know the answers. So questions such as, what types of restrictions did the Catholics face? And likewise, what types of restrictions did the dissenters face? How long had each of them faced these restrictions? Why did they face these restrictions? And were these restrictions always obeyed? Now, once I've created this list, I move on to step 4, where I begin conducting my research. I start developing a search strategy, looking at keywords in the particular questions that I've now developed, try to find resources which answer these questions, and I make note of these in the chart below. Whilst I'm doing this, you will also notice on the handout, I've left a column where you can add further questions which arise as you're approaching each of these individual resources. This is because you will find that as you're reading the research to answer the questions you've already come up with, further questions are going to arise. So add these questions here, and then you can use them when you go back to step 1 and begin the search cycle once again. So now I'll begin inputting each reference that I find in answer to my previous questions that I raised in step 3, and I'll put the answer to the question, and I'll think of any further questions that this might raise. So in one of the resources I've discovered, I find that one of the restrictions Catholics faced, and it was a major one, is they weren't allowed to sit in Parliament. And I make sure to include the reference. Now, this article also raises a further question because I find that Daniel O'Connell is mentioned as an important figure in Catholic emancipation. So now I might add another question. And then this question can be used when I return to step 1. So as you can see, approaching research this way does help to alleviate some of the overwhelming feelings you might feel with having such a big project. It helps you to break it down into digestible chunks. I hope you found this video helpful today. If you would like to access the handout yourself, please do click on the link in the description below and you'll be able to download it and indeed even modify it to add more columns or delete some of them if you find you have more or fewer questions than what I've added on the sheet. If you did enjoy this, please do subscribe to the channel for further research tips and leave any comments or questions below the description. Thank you.